Hi everyone, my name is Nicole, and today we're going to be reading Nancy Drew in the Bike Tour Mystery by Carolyn Keene, beginning with Chapter 1, Welcome to Ireland. And how long do you intend to stay in Ireland, Miss, The passport clerk glanced briefly over the U.S. passport in front of him. Miss Drew? About 2 weeks, Nancy Drew replied. I'm going on a cross-country cycling tour. The clerk's green eyes flicked up to glance at the tall, willowy American teenager with red blonde hair. He smiled. Well, I'm hoping your legs are strong then. Ireland's got a powerful lot of hills, especially here in the west. Nancy smiled back. Oh, I think I'm up to it. I've been training for a few weeks with my friend George. She pointed to the athletic-looking dark-haired girl standing in line behind her. Well, best of luck to you. He flipped her passport to a blank page, punched it with his stamping machine, and handed it back. Next! Nancy walked past the desk and joined her other friend, Bess Marvin, who had already passed through the immigration interview. Isn't it exciting, Nancy? Bess said. Everyone here is so friendly and warm. Nancy suppressed a smile. She was used to Bess's quick assumptions, but they still amused her. You can't judge a whole population by one official, she said. But yes, the Irish people are known for being very friendly. I can't wait to get on that bike and start whizzing through the countryside, Bess went on, twirling a lock of her blonde hair. Those pictures in the tour company's brochure made everything look so picturesque. Thatched roof cottages, woolly white sheep, crumbling stone walls. Just don't expect leprechauns, shamrocks, and pots of gold at the end of every rainbow, warned Nancy with a giggle. George Fane strode toward them, hitching her carry-on bag onto her shoulder. Well, that's over. Now on to the baggage claim. We better grab a cart. Bess brought a mountain of luggage. Bess stuck out her tongue at George, who was not only her close friend, but also her cousin. I didn't bring that much, she protested. After all, we'll be here 2 weeks, and we need at least 2 outfits per day. You can't expect me to go to dinner wearing the same clothes I've been bicycling in all day. Why not? That's what I plan to do, George said. Then remind me not to sit near you at dinner table. Woo! Bess waved a hand in front of her nose. The 3 girls trooped through a pair of glass doors to the swarming baggage claim area. Most of the bags from their flight had already circled into sight on the luggage carousel. Nancy quickly spotted her black suitcase, thanks to the neon green ribbon she had knotted onto its handle. George's big purple duffel bag was next to it. The 2 girls lifted their bags off the conveyor belt. Bess frowned as she began to search through the mounds of bags already removed from the carousel. 2 tan suitcases, just like my carry-on. Oh, there's one! She sprang over to the edge of the carousel and checked the ID tags on the suitcase. No, sorry, that belongs to someone else. It's just like mine, though. Bess, you'll never learn, George groaned. You buy this year's trendiest luggage style, and everyone on the flight has the same bags you do. I always find them eventually, Bess shot back. It isn't my fault you're in such a hurry. The rest of our tour group is waiting for us, Nancy reminded Bess. She exchanged wry glances with George. The 3 girls traveled together often. The scenario was familiar by now. As Bess scurried off to inspect another tan suitcase, Nancy was jostled from behind. Ever alert, she shifted around to see who it was. A broad-shouldered man in a black wool overcoat was shoving through the crowd, milling around the neighboring carousel. Something about his heavy-browed, tight-mouthed face made Nancy uneasy. Eyes trained on someone ahead in the foot traffic, he seemed in a great hurry. As he hoisted a duffel to his shoulder, Nancy idly noticed that the little finger was missing from his left hand. With the instincts of a trained detective, she glanced at the electronic sign above the adjacent carousel, noting that its flight was from Sydney, Australia. Found them, Nancy heard Bess announce. She turned to see Bess stacking her carry-on atop 2 large suitcases. And we don't need a cart, George. My new suitcases have wheels on them. So you do learn from experience, George grinned. After I've toted your heavy bags down so many long terminals. We still have to pass through customs inspection, Nancy reminded her friends, nodding towards the final set of doors. Oh, will they open our cases? Bess asked, looking concerned as she maneuvered her tower of luggage towards the doors. Probably not, but they do perform random checks of passengers' bags, Nancy said. I think they zero in on people who look suspicious. As they passed through the swinging doors, Nancy noticed one passenger who'd been called over to the customs official's table. The man in the black overcoat from the Australian flight. and from the expression on his face, Nancy guessed he wasn't happy about being inspected. Nancy's curiosity was piqued. Her father, prominent River Heights attorney Carson Drew, often told her she was a natural detective. Back home, she'd worked on several important cases. Even though she was on vacation, she couldn't help being intrigued by shady activity. Bess and George were hurrying ahead toward the exit doors. The Irish customs officials were apparently not interested in checking the three American girls' bags, and Nancy eagerly followed them, looking forward to meeting the rest of their cycling tour group. Emerging from the customs area, the girls looked around for their tour leader. They spotted him easily, a 20-something man with curly brown hair, holding up a cardboard sign reading McElhaney Tours. They walked over to him. "Mr. Prendergast?" George asked. The young man smiled. "Call me Bob," he said in an American accent. "Are you girls from River Heights?" "Yes, I'm George Fane, and here's Nancy Drew and Bess Marvin." George gestured towards her friends. Bob shook hands all around. "Glad to meet you. Did you have a good flight?" The girls nodded their heads. "Good. Some of the older folks around here. Some of the other folks are around here. Let me introduce you." He led the girls over to a small waiting area with vinyl couches. 3 other newly arrived passengers were slumped on the seats, surrounded by suitcases and looking weary from their flights. "We've got the whole American contingent now," Bob said cheerfully, parking Bess's stacked bags for her. "Everyone, here's George Fane, Nancy Drew, and Bess Marvin from River Heights. Girls, this is Carl Thompson. He's from Boston. College professor, right, Carl?" A large man with a bushy brown beard and twinkling dark eyes stood up. "Assistant professor in chemistry. But thanks for the promotion, Bob." "Any time," Bob replied brightly. "And here are Jim and Natalie DeFusco from California." "North or south?" Nancy asked as she shook hands with the young, suntan blonde couple. "Near San Diego," John DeFusco said. "I work construction, and Natalie manages a surf shop." "And you're missing surf season?" asked George. "Truth is," Natalie admitted, "when you live near sunny beaches year-round, you get tired of them. Believe it or not, we hope for chilly, rainy weather every day." "Great," Bob declared, "because this is Ireland, and I can promise it will rain. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got 2 other tour members coming out of customs any minute." He darted away. "Does it really rain so often here?" Bess wondered, looking out the airport window at a clear blue sky. Carl gave a philosophical shrug. "Sure, but look on the bright side. That's why Western Ireland's one of the greenest places on Earth." "I think rain's refreshing on a bicycle ride," George said. "Who wants hot weather when you're pedaling up and down hills?" "I'm with you on that," chuckled Carl. "I'm surprised that we have an American tour guide," Nancy remarked to the group. "Bob told me his specialty is cycling, not Ireland," Jim said, "but he's led several groups around here the past couple of years. He says it's a great country for cycling. Not too many mountains and lots of sightseeing." "Oh, I can't wait," Bess said. A moment later, Bob returned with a striking pair of girls, 1 redhead and 1 brunette, both nearly 6 feet tall. "Here we are," Bob said. "I'd like you to meet Rhonda and Rachel Selkirk." He repeated everyone's names for the newcomers. "G'day, all," brunette Rhonda said in a broad Australian accent. "Glad to be here at last. That flight from Sydney seemed to take forever. I'm really knackered." "Sorry, but I have to ask," Bess said. "You 2 look so much alike. Are you twins or sisters?" Red-haired Rachel laughed. "Just sisters, but don't worry, we get asked that all the time." "Now everybody collect your things and we can load them into the van," Bob said. "Terry, our driver, has got it parked right out at the curb." As the tour group began to gather their gear, a porter came up behind the Selkirks, pushing a cart. On it were a few handsome leather suitcases and 2 large, narrow packing crates that were curved at both ends. "Whoa, you brought your own bikes?" George exclaimed. "Wasn't that expensive?" Rachel looked vague. "I guess so," she said. "But we prefer to ride our bikes rather than what the tour company provides. Not to knock your bikes," she added apologetically to Bob. "These bikes were custom made for us," Rhonda added, tossing her shoulder-length brown hair. "Seemed a shame not to use them, eh?" "Those girls either are pro cyclists or they're awfully rich," Bess whispered to Nancy as they followed the others out the terminal's exit doors. "Probably the latter," Nancy replied softly, "judging from that expensive luggage. And pro cyclists aren't likely to join a tour like this." "If they've had bikes custom made, they must really be into cycling," George muttered, joining her friends. and they look like they're in top shape. I'll bet they're super cyclists." Nancy laughed. "And you're already determined to outride them," she teased her friend. "George, this isn't a race. We're just here to get some exercise and see Ireland at a leisurely pace." George nodded, but she kept studying the tall, athletic-looking Selkirks. The group headed for a cherry red van parked at the curb with McLeany Tours painted on the sides. A rumpled Irishman with a gloomy expression stood by the open side doors. "This is Terry O'Leary," Bob announced. "He'll drive your luggage from one night's hotel to the next while you cycle along. He's also the guy who can repair your bikes, so be nice to him." Terry flashed a gap-toothed smile, but Nancy wasn't convinced it was genuine. The tour members piled their luggage beside the McLeany van, then followed Bob to a sleek black minibus parked just behind it. Waiting to board the passenger van, Nancy sensed a commotion on the sidewalk behind her. Out of the corner of her eye, she recognized a black overcoat. It was the man with the missing finger from the Sydney flight. Then a connection clicked in her brain. Nancy peered inside the van. The Australian girls were sitting inside. Rhonda was rooting in her purse for something. Then Rachel looked out the window and spotted the man in the black overcoat. And Nancy could swear Rachel froze in fear. And now we're on chapter 2. The gang's all here. "Rhonda, wasn't that?" Rachel began, poking her sister in the arm. But Rhonda, barely looking up, caught her off. "Don't be silly, Rach," she said, tossing her thick brown hair. "We've only been in Ireland for an hour. How could you possibly recognize anyone?" Nancy watched Rachel's expression as she sank back in her seat. She didn't look at all convinced, Nancy thought. Climbing onto the bus, Nancy told herself to put the incident out of her mind. "You've been working on too many mysteries lately," she scolded herself. "You imagine crimes wherever you look. Just relax and enjoy your vacation." With everyone abroad, the minibus pulled away. After navigating the tangle of roads around Shannon Airport, they were soon rolling across open countryside. Nancy's first impression was an overwhelming sense of green. "So that's why green is always used to symbolize Ireland," George said, gazing out the window. "I've never seen such an intense color. Look at that old stone cottage," Bess exclaimed, pointing. "Isn't that charming?" "There sure is a lot of farmland around here," said Natalie DeFusco across the aisle. "Yeah, but what tiny farms," George said. "There's the next farmhouse already. And I don't see any big red barns like back home." "What I love are the crooked stone walls between the fields," Jim said. "Do you know they don't even use mortar to make those walls? They just pick up stones from the fields and fit them in place. But they're remarkably strong. Some of those walls are well over 100 years old." Natalie rolled her eyes. "Trust to you, Jim, to know all the construction details." The bus curved around the winding roads until, less than an hour later, they pulled up to a large rambling house, a quirky pile of eaves and gables in warm yellow stone. "Wow, what is this? Someone's country manor?" Bess asked, impressed. George scanned the tour itinerary Bob had passed out to the group. "It says this is our hotel for the first night, Ballyrae House. We're in a town called Lahinch, on the western coast." "Terry has already arrived, I see," Bob said, standing up and spotting the red van in a side lot. "Your luggage will be taken up to your rooms. In the meantime, let's gather for a quick meeting." Bob led the way through a marble entry hall and into a wood-paneled parlor, where a young couple sat in a pair of leather armchairs. "Ah, I see our final 2 cyclists are here," Bob said. "Folks, meet Derek Thorogood and Camilla Collins, just off the ferry from England." As Derek and Camilla shook hands and learned the names of their tour companions, Nancy noticed Bess's dazzled expression. Even Nancy had to admit that Derek was handsome, with his shaggy dark hair, lazy gray eyes, and clean-cut features. "Here goes Bess with another crush," George whispered in Nancy's ear. "I bet she hasn't even noticed that Derek brought a girlfriend with him." "I heard that," Bess muttered, whirling around. "And just because they travel together doesn't mean they're boyfriend and girlfriend." "No, but I'd say it's a pretty good clue," George shot back. "That and the fact that Camilla's draped herself all over his shoulder." "Relax, girls," Nancy broke in. "Time will tell whether or not Derek is available. And even if he isn't, who cares? This seems like a great bunch of people. I'm looking forward to riding with them. All of them." As a waiter passed around cold drinks, Bob asked the members of the tour group to sit down. This is probably a good time to go over the protocols for a tour. You all have copies of the itinerary I passed out. Several members of the group waved their itineraries in the air. Hang on to these, Bob advised. They'll be your Bibles for the next 10 days. There's a page for each day which will supplement each morning with a detailed road map of that day's route. The itinerary tells where a lunch stop will be, usually a historic site. I've typed up a brief paragraph describing each lunch site, but you can use your own guidebooks for more details. Got mine, Carl said, holding up a thick paperback book. From the dog-eared pages, Nancy guessed Carl had done plenty of pre-trip research. We also describe other sites you'll pass along the way, Bob continued. Some of you may want to stop and explore. Others may be more interested in keeping up a good cycling pace. You're free to go as you please. Natalie DeFusco frowned. But aren't we going to ride as a group? Bob shook his head. After a few years of running these cycling tours, I've learned that doesn't work. You're all at different levels. Excuse me. You're all at different levels of cycling ability. Some people may want to ride 40 or 50 miles in a day. Others may get tired after 15 or 20. That'll be me, Camilla Collins admitted, noting the English girl's fair skin, manicured nails, and carefully styled brown hair. Nancy guessed she wasn't the outdoors type. Well, we've designed the tour to work for all levels, Bob reassured them. As often as possible, I've plotted out a longer route and a shorter route for each day's ride. And if you want to quit after the morning ride, Terry can drive you from the lunch stop to that evening's hotel. What if you want to sleep late in the morning? Jim DeFusco asked, winking at Natalie. Well, then Terry can drive you to catch up with the tour at the lunch stop, Bob said, with a sideways grin. But seriously, I wouldn't advise that. It's always better to ride in the morning when the air is cooler and clearer. Nancy raised her hand. It sounds like we're going to be all over the place, she remarked. How will you keep track of everybody, for safety's sake? Glad you asked, Nancy, Bob said. Each morning, when I hand out the day's maps, I'll also give a cell phone to each couple of riders. Both Terry and I are programmed into the speed dial, so you can call us anytime. If you get lost or need a repair, we'll find you. Terry can get there faster, of course, since he's got the van. You won't be in the van? Rhonda asked. No, I'll be on my bike, riding along with you all, Bob explained. I'll try to catch up with every group at some time throughout the day, and of course we'll all meet at lunch. You said each couple of riders. Are we assigned to ride in pairs? Derek asked, his gaze flickering for an instant towards Camilla. Recalling Camilla's comment, Nancy guessed he was a more serious cyclist than his girlfriend. Bob shook his head. I hope you'll ride with different people each day, he said. That's the great thing about riding with a group, getting to know one another. Of course, the really fast riders may not care to stay too long with the slower riders, so we'll be flexible. The only rule is, always ride with at least one other person, and always have a phone with each group. Beyond that, you can sort it out for yourselves. A satisfied murmur arose from the crowd. Sounds like they thought out all the problems, George remarked to Nancy and Bess. Well, I'm glad I won't have to keep up with you two all the time, Bess said, sighing in relief. Nancy chuckled. You should have followed George's training plan for the past month, Bess. You'd be in a lot better cycling shape now. I know, Bess admitted, but it seemed so boring at the time. Well, don't complain to me if every muscle in your body is sore tomorrow night, George teased her cousin. Bob Prendergast lifted his voice above the crowd. Everybody, listen up. We've got several bikes parked outside. He gestured toward a pair of French doors leading to a side terrace. I know Rhonda and Rachel brought their own, but the rest of you have to choose a bike to ride throughout the tour. So can we step outside? Everyone eagerly jumped to their feet and went outdoors. Terry O'Leary stood behind a row of gleaming 10-speed bikes. Their slim aluminum tube frames were painted a bright variety of colors. Dibs on the powder blue one, Bess called. Better try it out first, warned Terry O'Leary. Forget the color. You want one that'll suit your height and arm reach. Bess, blushing with embarrassment, obediently swung her leg over the bike so that Terry could measure how her feet hit the pedals. Seat's a bit high yet, he muttered. He whipped a hexagonal wrench out of the pocket of his grubby corduroy pants and lowered the seat post. Next, he adjusted the angle of the handlebars. Now it'll do, miss, he said gruffly. Bess pushed off, tottering on the blue bicycle. The rest of the group crowded around the various bikes to make their choices. Nancy selected a dark green bicycle, while George settled on a bronze-colored one. "These are good bikes. Not as good as mine at home, but still very rideable," George said approvingly. Rhonda Selkirk spoke up from the terrace wall where she sat with her sister. "Funny how heavy those aluminum frames look, now that I'm used to titanium," she said casually. George shot Rhonda a glance that wasn't at all friendly. The weight difference can't be more than a pound or two," she said. "True," Rhonda replied agreeably. "Still, every ounce matters when you're climbing a hill." "Remember, these are touring bikes, not dirt bikes," Bob spoke above the hubbub. "Those narrow tires don't have thick treads, so they puncture easily. You may get flats. I'll give you all tire repair kits so you can put on a temporary patch, pump up the mended tire, and ride on. Then Terry can put a new inner tube and tire on that night." "Better still, don't ride over any nails or broken glass," Rhonda joked. Bob grinned. "That too," he said. "And one more thing. You Americans, don't forget to ride on the left-hand side of the road." One by one, the tour members claimed bikes and then drifted off to their rooms. Nancy, Bess, and George found the large room they were sharing on the second floor. "Too bad," Bess said, gazing out the window at the rolling countryside. "I peeked in Rhonda and Rachel's room across the hall, and they have an ocean view." "Wouldn't you know it," grumbled George. "Now, give the Selkirks a break," Bess said. "They can't help being rich. And Rhonda may be a bit spoiled, but Rachel's okay." "You know," Nancy said, "I didn't tell you guys about this before, but in the airport I noticed this one shifty-looking guy on the Sydney flight. I swear Rachel recognized him as we drove off, and she looked pretty upset." "Did Rhonda see him?" asked Bess. "That was odd too," Nancy said. Rhonda shook her head at Rachel without even looking to see if she knew the guy. It was like she knew he was there, but didn't want to admit it. George touched Nancy's forehead as if testing for fever. "You need some time off, Nan," she said with a grin. "You're getting a little paranoid. Anyway, it happened back at Shannon. I bet we never run into that character again." An hour later, the girls went down to meet the group for dinner. "Now we'll get the view," Nancy said as they entered the dining room. A huge picture window on the west wall showed a brilliant sunset sparkling over the Atlantic. Rachel Selkirk joined the River Heights girls at the window. "What a ripper of a view," she said. "I'm so glad we chose to do the cycling trip. You can really get in touch with the landscape when you ride through it instead of just staring out the window of the car." Nancy was just about to reply when she heard a slither and a soft thud behind her. She whirled around to check out what had happened. There lay Rhonda Selkirk, collapsed in a heap on the dining room floor. And now we're on to Chapter 3, A Wee Bit of Trouble. Derek Thorogood jumped up from where he had been sitting next to Rhonda. "I was talking to her, and she got all woozy. She started swaying about in her chair, then she tipped over." Everyone in the dining room broke out in worried murmurs. Almost as one, they rose from their seats and gathered around the spot where Rhonda lay sprawled on the carpet. Bob Prendergast pushed through the onlookers. "Rhonda?" He knelt quickly at her side and laid a hand against her cheek. "Her breathing seems to be okay," Bess pointed out. She'd worked at Nancy's side often enough to have a pretty good idea of what to look for in an emergency. "Does her skin feel cold and clammy or hot and feverish?" "Neither," Bob said shortly. "Still, I think we better call a doctor. I'll go ask the innkeeper to phone a local physician." He searched the ring of faces around him for Rhonda's sister. "Rachel, everything will be okay." Rachel, looking numb with shock, gave a tense little nod. Bob jumped up and jogged out of the dining room in search of the inn's owners. Some instinct made Nancy take a careful look around the circle tour group. To her surprise, she saw that Derek Thorogood was quietly lifting a camera up to his face. Could he really be planning to take a picture of Rhonda lying unconscious? Why would anyone be so intrusive? But before she could do anything, Natalie DeFusco's voice broke in. "You were sitting with her, Derek. What happened?" she asked. All eyes turned on him. Derek swiftly slid the camera under his blazer. He pointed to the glass of orange soda sitting on the table at Rhonda's suddenly empty space. "She had just taken a few sips of that orange squash," he said, and his dark eyebrows knit in concern. Nancy heard a little gasp from behind her. She wheeled around to see Rachel, her face completely pale beneath its sprinkling of freckles. But that was my soda," she cried out. Nancy gripped the back of the chair next to her. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but if the orange soda was But if the orange soda was responsible for Rhonda's blackout, then had it been intended for Rhonda to drink or for Rachel? As the group rallied around Rachel, Nancy sank back on a nearby table, her mind racing. Glancing at her watch, she did a swift calculation. Rhonda couldn't have been in the room longer than 5 minutes before Nancy arrived. Most poisons and drugs take at least 20 minutes to take effect. Of the ones that work immediately, most cause vomiting, convulsions, or gastric pain. But Nancy could see Rhonda lying there on the red patterned rug, not writhing, not thrashing around, not even breathing very hard. Nancy rose to her feet and began to move toward the suspect glass of soda, careful not to let anyone notice her. But Carl Thompson got there first. He picked up the half-full glass, raised it to his nose, and sniffed. No unusual odor, the professor remarked. If the drink had been laced with cyanide, it would smell like almonds. Nancy exchanged a quick glance with Bess. Maybe she wouldn't have to reveal her identity as a detective after all. Do you really think anyone would put cyanide in her drink? Natalie asked. Carl shrugged. I'm not a detective, just a chemist, he said. But if something in the glass caused her to pass out, it was either a poison like cyanide or some drug. Barbiturate powder, maybe. A drug wouldn't have a distinguishing scent, however. Trying to act like an ordinary bystander so as not to make anyone feel uncomfortable, Nancy asked Carl, How would you find out? Could you run a chemical test of the remaining soda? Carl smiled. Well, I'm no traveling lab, but I could probably improvise. With a few household chemicals, I could run some preliminary tests. We don't need testing yet, Bob Prendergast broke in, rejoining the group. There's a physician driving over from the next town to look at Rhonda. Let's wait for his diagnosis. This could be a simple medical situation, a reaction to some medication or something like that. Meanwhile, could someone fetch a blanket? If Rhonda's blood pressure's dropped, she needs to stay warm. As though relieved to have something definite to do, the members of the tour bustled around. Nancy took advantage of their stir to draw Bob aside. Did you contact the police, she said. Bob's eyes darted nervously sideways. Well, no, not yet. I don't see any need to make a fuss. Rhonda wouldn't want the police involved. How can you know that? Nancy asked. Bob flinched. It would be a violation of the Selkirk's privacy, he explained. And I promised them. He choked off what he was going to say, casting his eyes downward. If I were in their situation, I'd want the police called, Nancy said gently. Bob's eyes flew up to meet hers. What do you know about their situation? He challenged her. Suddenly, Nancy heard a shattering sound from behind. She whirled around. The glass of orange soda had been knocked off the table where Carl had so carefully set it aside. A puddle of sticky orange liquid was soaking into the red patterned carpet, oozing around a few big shards of glass. Terry O'Leary was already on his knees, mopping up the spill with a pile of paper napkins. Sorry, clumsy me, he muttered. He plucked glass shards up with his fingers and dropped them into the nearest waste bin, then crunched up a handful of soggy orange napkins and threw them away. Nancy clenched her fist at her side. Now they'd never be able to have that liquid tested. Nancy caught George's eye and jerked her head upward, indicating the need to talk privately. George nodded and glanced at Bess. Bess looked back at Nancy and fluttered her eyelids in reply. Nancy backed quietly out of the dining room, hoping no one would notice her going. She trotted up the staircase to the girls' room. A moment later, George came in, followed soon after by Bess. Nancy was tense with anger and disappointment. Terry O'Leary spilled Rhonda's glass of soda, she fumed. Now we'll never learn what may have been in it. If I could even get my hands on one piece of glass, there might have been enough soda on it to test. It's a tough break, no pun intended, but accidents do happen, Bess said. Nancy's blue eyes flashed. I'm not so sure it was an accident. What if Terry meant to spill that soda? He heard Carl say he was going to test it. Why would Terry want to prevent Carl from testing the soda? George asked. I'm not sure, Nancy admitted, but I got the distinct impression that Bob wasn't eager to call in the police. And Terry does work for Bob. You think Terry and Bob have something to do with Rhonda's passing out? Bess looked amazed. Nancy sighed and shrugged. It's possible. One thing's for sure, something fishy is going on here. I get the sense there's something about Rhonda and Rachel that we don't know, and this mix-up with the soda bothers me. Maybe we should find out more about Derek, George said. He was right next to Rhonda at the table. He had a perfect opportunity to slip something in her drink, didn't he? Bess flushed. How dare you accuse Derek of doing anything wrong? George blew out an impatient little breath. Come on, Bess. Just because you think the guy's gorgeous doesn't mean he's innocent. Bess glared at her cousin. It's not just because he's gorgeous. If he had poisoned Rhonda, why would he point out to everybody that she just drank the soda? He would have tried to hide it if he'd been messing with her drink. You've got a point, Bess, Nancy said. All the same, we can't rule him out. I think he was just about to snap a photo of Rhonda while she was lying there. How rude is that? I'd like to know a little more about Derek Thorogood myself. You bet, George chimed in. I mean, he came with Camilla, but he's been hovering around Rhonda and Rachel ever since we arrived. What gives? Bess rolled her eyes. Maybe he's just being friendly. There's no crime in that. I'm not saying he's a criminal. I just like to know more about him, Nancy said. And that goes for everybody on this tour. All three of us must keep our eyes and ears open. Now let's go back downstairs before anyone misses us. Maybe the doctor's here. She pushed open the door to the room and stepped out in the passageway, casually tucking her hair behind her ears. A movement down the hall caught her eye. A few yards away, Derek Thorogood crouched in a narrow cranny, hunched over something in his right hand. He was talking quickly and talking quickly and softly to himself. Sensing Nancy's presence, he froze against the wall. Nancy's sharp eyes picked up the gleam of a tiny electronic device in Derek's hand. It looked like a tape recorder. Derek thrust the device hastily into his pocket and jumped up. A glib smile spread over his handsome features. Oh, Nancy, I came up to find you. Thought you might like to know. All's well after all. Rhonda came to just after you left. Seems none the worse for her scare, thank goodness. Well, that's a relief, Nancy said in a guarded tone of voice. The doctor never came, but Rhonda swears it was nothing. No medical condition, she's not on any medicines, nothing of that sort. So it was probably an allergic reaction to something in the soda. He blithely waved his hand. Or maybe jet lag. Anyway, they're about to serve dinner. Where are your two friends? He looked over Nancy's shoulder. They came up to use the bathroom, Nancy said. You mean the loo? Derek smiled and began to guide Nancy toward the stairs. I'm making it my mission to teach you Americans the local lingo, you know. I appreciate it, Nancy said, flashing him a smile. She had to agree with Bess. Derek Thorogood was good-looking and charming, too, but she still didn't trust him. The low-beam dining room rang with chatter as Nancy and Derek entered. Nancy glimpsed Rhonda and Rachel at a table with the DeFuscos, looking as if nothing had happened. Derek led Nancy to a table near the picture window. Well, that was enough excitement for one evening, I can tell you, Camilla said, smiling up at Nancy. Yes, indeed, Nancy replied. She took a seat next to Carl Thompson. Derek rubbed his hands together and began to back away from the table. Well, I'll just leave those other seats open for Beth and Joe, shall I? Bess and George, Nancy corrected him. But they can find other seats. Like Bob said, we should all mingle and get to know one another. She patted the chair beside her for Derek to sit down. Yes. Well, all the more reason why I should sit somewhere else. Right, Camilla? And before she could reply, Derek had gone to join Bob and Terry at a table by the door. I can still keep an eye on her from here, Nancy thought, shifting her chair slightly. She lifted her menu and began to decide what to order. But the next time she remembered to look up, as the soup plates were being taken away, she saw that Derek's chair at the table near the door was empty. All right, and now we're on our final chapter of the day, Chapter 4, A Need for Speed. So what if Derek did leave the dining room? Bess said as the girls walked in their room later. Bess, you've got to admit he's acting suspicious, George argued. First, Nancy saw him try to snap a photo of Rhonda while she was knocked out. Then he was whispering into a tape recorder. Then he steered Nancy to a table away from Rhonda and Rachel so she couldn't ask them any questions. And after I sat down, he sat somewhere else so I couldn't ask him any questions, Nancy added, tugging a brush through her hair. Then he snuck out of the dining room for almost 15 minutes, George said. Maybe he had to finish recording his tape, Beth suggested. Yes, but why was he making a tape recording in the first place? George demanded, pointing her toothbrush accusingly at Bess. None of it makes sense yet, Nancy said. But like I said, we should be alert for the next few days. I can't help thinking Rhonda and Rachel are the key to everything. We should ride with them tomorrow, George said, to keep an eye on them. Bess raised her eyebrows. You two can ride with the Selkirk, she said, rolling over on the bed. Not me. Those girls are as tall and strong as Amazons. Plus, they have those fancy titanium bikes. There's no way I'd keep up with them. Nancy fought a yawn. Well, there's no way I'll keep up with them either if I don't get to bed. I didn't sleep much on the plane last night. Too excited. On River Heights time, it's only 4 p.m., but it's 10 here and I'm totally zonked. Let's turn in. I'll take Rhonda, you take Rachel, George murmured to Nancy the next morning. They glanced over to where the Selkirk sisters stood beside the hotel steps in their high-tech riding gear, snug black knit shorts and zip-up spandex jerseys. George self-consciously adjusted the legs of her form-fitting blue shorts, bought new for this trip. Her banana yellow jersey was emblazoned with the name of an Italian racing team. Nancy and Bess had opted for ordinary clothes, khaki cotton hiking shorts, roomy t-shirts, and windbreakers. You ride with them, and I'll ride with Derek Thorogood, Bess offered. George gave her a sarcastic look. Well, you said we should watch him too, Bess said, a twinkle in her eye. It was a bright, clear morning with a balmy breeze. As the tour group gathered outside the hotel, Bob Prendergast handed out the day's maps, along with plastic water bottles. Lunch today is a picnic overlooking the cliffs of Moher, Bob reminded everybody. Be there by 12:30. Or, as we say over here, 12:30, Derek added, waggling his eyebrows. Nancy walked her bicycle over to the Selkirks. Love your matching magenta bike, she said, but how do you tell them apart? Rachel smiled. Easy, I've put silver tape on my handlebars, and Rhonda's got black. She pointed to her down-curved handlebars. Bob Prendergast joined them. Who's riding with whom today? Nancy turned to Rachel. Could we ride together? She asked quickly. Rachel shrugged as she lifted her silver helmet to strap it on. Sure, why not? Okay, Rachel and Nancy, here's a cell phone for the day. Bob handed Nancy a bulky, slightly outdated model of a cell phone. Push speed dial 1 to reach me, speed dial 2 for Terry. I could ride with you, Rhonda, George piped up, standing behind Bob. Great, Rhonda and George are a team, Bob said, handing his cell phone to Rhonda. I'm glad you're mixing partners. Have a good ride. He bustled off to finish equipping the other riders. Rhonda shot an annoyed look at George. Hope you don't mind riding fast, she snapped, slinging her black helmet on top of her glossy dark hair. Rhonda swung onto her bike and pushed off, with George scrambling in her wake. Rachel smiled at Nancy. I have to confess, I have a serious need for speed myself, she said. That's why Rhonda and I hoped we could ride together, but I'm willing to give you a go. Thanks, Nancy said, fitting on her own helmet. Don't worry, I like to ride fast too. Nancy and Rachel swung out the hotel parking lot, turning right onto the road that led north. They cycled downhill to La Hinch, its main street lined with shops and restaurants. This looks like a popular resort, Nancy shouted to Rachel, who was riding ahead. I even saw a dive shop back there. Funny, I wouldn't have thought of scuba diving off the coast of Ireland. Rachel nodded but said nothing. A moment later, Nancy tried again. That looks like a good golf course up ahead. Camilla was saying last night that Country Claire's a big golf area. Lots of famous courses. She paused, fishing for a response. Do you play golf? Rachel shifted in her seat so she could shout to Nancy. Sorry, don't mean to be unfriendly, but I don't like yabbering and yakking while I'm riding. It interrupts the flow, don't you think? Nancy cheerfully replied, Okay. But she felt crestfallen. She'd hoped to learn some details about Rachel by talking to her. But even more important, she'd hoped to gain Rachel's confidence. Now she was afraid Rachel would write her off as a chatty airhead. And a chatty airhead who couldn't cycle seriously, Nancy added to herself a few miles further on. Everything was all right so long as they rode downhill. But just past La Hinch, the road narrowed and began to climb. George's training regimen had improved Nancy's wind, stamina, and leg strength, but she still didn't know how to shift gears on hills like Rachel did. She stood up on her pedals to gain extra power as she pushed her bike up the challenging slope. Looking ahead, she saw that Rachel was still seated, paddling rapidly but smoothly. Nancy fumbled with her gear lever, shifting down so that she could pedal with less resistance. But it was too late. She'd already lost momentum. The distance between her and Rachel lengthened by the second. Nancy gritted her teeth, determined not to ask Rachel to slow down. Even without turning, Rachel must have sensed that Nancy had fallen way behind. She halted and got off her bike at the top of the hill. Nancy toiled up the last few steep yards, trying hard not to show the exertion. "Now this is what I call a view," Rachel said as Nancy finally reached her side. Nancy nodded gamely and pivoted toward the northwest. What she saw made her completely forget her cycling efforts. Stretching ahead before them, for about 5 miles, was a stretch of spectacular coastal cliffs, their sheer sides ribboned with 5 layers of different colored rock face. On the stony ledges nestled huge flocks of puffins and other seabirds. To the left of the Atlantic Ocean gleamed and danced. Takes your breath away, eh? Rachel asked. It took a second for Nancy to realize that Rachel was kidding her. "Oh, so that's why I can't breathe," she said, playing along. "And I thought it was from running up the hill." Rachel laughed along with her, but Nancy felt embarrassed. "A new bike always takes getting used to," Rachel said tactfully. "Let's get a drink and stretch your calves before we go on." Nancy nodded and dismounted, hardly daring to admit what a relief it was. Leaning her bike against the signpost, she took her water bottle from a bracket on her bike and took a long swig. "Looks like we still have some uphill riding to do," Rachel said. Crouching down, she ran her fingers through the gravel on the road's edge by Nancy's bike. "What's that out there?" She pointed north, where a few dark islands dotted the sea. Nancy peered at her map for a moment. "Looks like those are the Aran Islands," she finally decided. Rachel stood up suddenly. "Well, we should get going." She grabbed her bike and swung up into the seat. "Ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be." Nancy stuffed the map in her pocket and jumped on her bike. Rachel was off with a spurt of the gravel before Nancy could fit her shoes into the toe clips on her pedals. The two bikes sped smoothly down the brief slope that followed the hilltop, but soon the road angled upwards again. This time, Nancy paid more attention to gear shifting, clicking down to a lower gear each time the pedals began to strain. "Now I've got the hang of it," she told herself. She kept her eyes trained on the rear reflector below Rachel's seat and fought to match Rachel's pace. Then suddenly, everything went wrong. Nancy's front wheel jerked and wobbled. She heard a grating sound on the pavement. The bike began to lean sideways. Nancy squeezed her handbrakes hard. The rear reflector on Rachel's bike whizzed uphill and away. Nancy hopped off and examined her front wheel. As she feared, the tire was totally flat. Even worse, it looked like the steel rim of the wheel had cut through the rubber treads. "Rachel!" Nancy called out. The Australian girl was already up the top of the hill, but she circled and coasted back down to Nancy. "Looks like you've come a cropper," Rachel said as she saw Nancy's flat. "You won't be able to mend it with a patch kit. Better call that Terry bloke and have him pick you up." With a sigh, Nancy phoned Terry and told him where to find her. As she hung up, Rachel began waving. "Look, Jim, Natalie, and Carl are just down the hill," she said. "You don't mind if I ride with them, do you? I'll leave you the cell." "That's fine. Terry will be here soon," Nancy said, swallowing her regret. After the others had ridden away, Nancy rechecked her tire. She frowned. The tread in the inner tube had a long, straight cut in them. Not a simple puncture or a jagged rip. A worrisome thought struck Nancy. Had Rachel done something to the tire at the top of the hill? Nancy replayed the scene in her mind. Rachel crouched by Nancy's bike, making Nancy gaze out at the ocean and then pore over her map. She'd have time to slash Nancy's tire. But had she done it? And if she had, why? "Nancy, stop rooting about that flat," Beth shouted above the music. "You covered the day's route all right after Terry fixed it, didn't you?" Nancy shook her head. "Yes, I know, sorry. But it isn't just getting a flat. Anybody could get a flat tire. It just seems so odd." Nancy was cut off by the night's entertainment. The musicians finished with a flourish, and wild applause filled the Curragh pub, right up to its low oak beam ceiling. The tour was spending the night in Doolin, a fishing village famous for the music pubs along a short main street. Across the room, Nancy glimpsed Rhonda and Rachel, both safe and sound, sitting at a table with Derek and Camilla. "There's no reason to suspect Rachel caused my flat tire," Nancy scolded herself. "Just because she didn't want to chat while we were riding, and just because she was eager to ride away with other people. She's focused on her cycling, that's all." Nancy told herself to stop fretting. After all, when would she hear such delightful music again? Getting into the spirit, she started to stamp her feet with the chorus. Her thigh muscles twinged painfully. George noticed and giggled. "Don't worry, Nan, I'm sore too," she whispered. "So much for keeping up with the Selkirks." Nancy grinned and glanced back over the Australian's table. Derek was leaning over and whispering in Rhonda's ear, while Camilla, looking oblivious, swayed to the music. But where had Rachel gone? Nancy stiffened and looked around. Though the room was crowded, it was small. Despite the noise and the haze of smoke from a peat fire, every cheery corner was visible, and Rachel was nowhere. Nancy rose uneasily and started to move towards the door as the sea chanty ended. The applause was dying down when she heard an awful clatter outside, followed by a moan of pain. Dashing outside, Nancy nearly tripped over Rachel, sprawled on the cobbled street with the pub's heavy wooden sign lying beside her. Alright, and today that ends chapter 1 through 4 of Nancy Drew and the Bike Tour Mystery. We'll pick up again tomorrow with chapter 5, and I'll see you guys next time. Go ahead and leave a comment down below if you have any theories, what the mystery might be, what's going on with Rhonda and Rachel. If you have any other thoughts, be sure to let me know. And I hope you have a great day. Goodbye.